Close your eyes and let the world around you fade. Tonight we travel back, far back, into an age before Rome, before Greece, before the empires we so often remember. We journey into a forgotten world, where kings carved their names into clay, armies thundered across the plains with horse-drawn chariots, and an empire of stone and fire rose and fell, leaving behind only ruins and whispers in the dust. This is the story of the Hittites, the forgotten empire of the Bronze Age kings. Their realm stretched across the heart of Anatolia, what we know today as Turkey, a rugged land of mountains and plateaus. They were masters of diplomacy and war, of treaties and conquest, of worship and sacrifice. Yet for centuries, their memory was lost. Unlike Egypt, whose pyramids loomed eternal, or Mesopotamia, whose rivers still whisper of Sumer and Babylon, the Hittites disappeared from history's stage. For nearly 3,000 years, their story was buried. And so, when we speak of them now, we are piecing together fragments, inscriptions on clay tablets, broken walls in a ruined city called Hattusa, and echoes preserved in the archives of their rivals. But together, these fragments form a mosaic, a portrait of a people who were once counted among the great powers of the ancient world. To understand the Hittites, we must first set the stage, the world of the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was an era defined by innovation and fragility. From roughly 3000 to 1200 before Common Era, civilizations rose along rivers and coasts, harnessing bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, to forge weapons, tools, and symbols of status. It was an age of city-states and kingdoms, of trade networks stretching across thousands of miles. A merchant in Mesopotamia might handle tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from faraway mountains, or gold from Nubia. Ships sailed across the eastern Mediterranean, bearing cedar from Lebanon, wine from Greece, and grain from Egypt. And yet, beneath this glittering web of exchange, danger lurked. Bronze was powerful, but dependent on trade routes. Cut off the flow of tin, and kingdoms could falter. Crop failures could bring famine. Raids and invasions could unravel the delicate balance. It was a world rich with splendor, but always shadowed by collapse. It is within this world that the Hittites emerged. The Hittites left us an extraordinary window into their world. Their archives of clay tablets, buried in the ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of these tablets, letters, treaties, prayers, laws. In them, the voices of kings and queens still speak. They tell of battles fought, of oaths sworn, of plagues endured, and of gods invoked. They tell us of a people practical and ambitious, stern, yet deeply religious, navigating a world of shifting power. Perhaps most striking, the Hittites were among the first in history to create written treaties. Their diplomacy was legendary. In an age of conquest, they understood the art of negotiation. They struck bargains with neighbors, swore pacts sealed by divine witness, and even pioneered the idea of equal treaties between great powers. something we still see echoes of today. But this would come later. First, the Hittites had to survive. The early kingdom was a fragile creation, surrounded by rivals, the Hurrians to the east, the powerful cities of Mesopotamia to the south, and other Anatolian peoples pressing in. They had to fight for every piece of land they held. Hattusa marched his forces towards Syria, clashing with mighty city-states like Aleppo. In these campaigns, the Hittites began to carve out their reputation as formidable warriors, masters of the chariot, wielders of bronze weapons, and iron-forged strength. Iron, yes. Though the world still lived in the Bronze Age, the Hittites were among the first to experiment with iron. The technology was not yet widespread nor decisive, but it foreshadowed a future that would one day end the Bronze Age entirely. To their neighbors, the Hittites seemed almost touched by secret knowledge, as though the earth itself yielded up to them a power others could not yet master. But kings do not live forever. Hattusa grew old. In his final days, he dictated what we know as his testament. It is a remarkable document, inscribed in cuneiform, in which the king reflects on his life, his conquests, and his failures. He names his successor, not his biological son, but his grandson, Murshali. In this act, we glimpse the pragmatism of the Hittites. Kingship was not merely bloodline, but the ability to rule, to hold the fragile state together. And so, with the death of Hattusa, a new chapter began. Murshali I, still a young man, inherited the throne. He would take the kingdom farther than his grandfather had ever dreamed. Leading his armies across the mountains and deserts, he marched all the way to Babylon, the ancient city of Hammurabi's fame. In a lightning campaign, the Hittites stormed the city, plundering its treasures and leaving it weakened for others to seize. It was an extraordinary achievement. Few could claim to have brought Babylon low, but the triumph was fleeting. Murshali's long march left the heartland exposed, and rivals struck back. In the chaos that followed, Murshali was assassinated, cut down not by foreign enemies, but by a conspiracy within his own court. This was a pattern that would haunt the Hittite kingdom. Brilliance and betrayal, conquest and collapse, cycles of rise and fall. And yet, each time, the kingdom endured. For the Hittites were nothing if not resilient. Their cities were fortified with massive stone walls. Their rulers, though often contested, held firm to the rituals of kingship. Their people, bound by a deep reverence for their gods, believed their survival depended on honoring the divine order. Through wars, assassinations, and shifting alliances, the Hittites pressed on. And slowly, steadily, they grew stronger. From these turbulent beginnings, an empire was taking shape. An empire that would one day stand shoulder to shoulder with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. An empire that would fight the greatest battle of the ancient world, and then vanish, almost without a trace. But for now, as the 16th and 15th centuries before Common Era unfolded, the Hittites were still finding their way. Kings rose and fell. Enemies threatened from all sides. And yet, the memory of Hattusili and Mershili lingered, a reminder that even in the rugged hills of Anatolia, an empire could be forged by ambition, cunning, and sheer will. The world of the Hittites was never simple. Their land was rugged, their enemies many, and their throne always uncertain. Yet it was out of this turbulence that the foundations of their empire were laid. To understand how the Hittites endured, we must return to their heart, the city of Hattusa. Hattusa was not a place chosen lightly. Nestled among rocky hills in central Anatolia, its position was both a blessing and a challenge. The surrounding land was fertile enough to sustain crops, yet difficult enough to deter easy invasion. Its cliffs and ridges lent themselves naturally to defense, and over time, the Hittites transformed it into a fortress like no other. Archaeologists who walk its ruins today still marvel at the massive stone walls that encircled the city. Walls that once stretched for kilometers, punctuated by monumental gates, the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate, each adorned with carvings of protective deities and beasts. Passing through them, an ancient visitor would have felt the weight of power, the sense of entering not just a city, but the beating heart of a kingdom. Inside, the city was alive with activity. Temples dedicated to dozens of gods stood beside administrative buildings. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script were stored in archives that rivaled those of Mesopotamia. The royal palace loomed over the lower city, its courtyards and chambers the stage for both politics and ceremony. Hattusa was no mere settlement. It was a capital worthy of kings. But a capital is only as strong as the rulers who command it. After the death of Mershili I, the kingdom staggered. Assassinations and palace intrigues tore at its stability. The Hittites seemed destined to fade before they had truly risen. Yet time and again, they found new leaders, men who could seize chaos and shape it into order. Among these was Telepinu, a king whose reign began in the 16th century before Common Era. Telepinu understood the dangers of constant civil war. In a kingdom so often shaken by assassinations and disputes over succession, he sought to impose order. He issued what is now known as the Edict of Telepinu, a remarkable document etched into clay that laid down clear rules for royal succession. It was, in essence, a constitution of sorts, an attempt to bind the monarchy to stability. He declared that the throne must pass to the eldest son, or failing that, to the nearest male relative. By establishing a principle of inheritance, he sought to prevent the endless bloodshed that had plagued his predecessors. The Edict of Telepinu tells us something vital about the Hittites. They were not merely warriors or builders, they were thinkers. They recognized that power alone could not sustain a kingdom. Law, tradition, and order were just as essential. In this, they stand alongside the lawgivers of Mesopotamia, like Hammurabi, as pioneers of governance in the ancient world. Yet even with Telepinu's reforms, the Hittite kingdom remained vulnerable. For generations, it lingered in the shadows, a regional power but not yet an empire. To the south, mighty Egypt grew strong under the new kingdom pharaohs. To the east, the Hurrians and Mitanni forged their own dominions. To the west, rival peoples of Anatolia pressed against the Hittite borders. It would take new rulers, new wars, and new visions to elevate the Hittites from kingdom to empire. The turning point came in the 14th century before Common Era, with the reign of Suppiluliuma I. But before we reach him, we must pause to understand what gave the Hittites their enduring strength. The secret lay not only in their kings, but in their gods. The Hittite pantheon was vast, so vast that their enemies mocked them as the people of 1,000 gods. Every conquered city, every subdued people, every new land brought its deities into the fold. The storm god Tarhunt, the sun goddess of Arinna, the protective lion gods of the gates, each held a place in the rituals of the kingdom. This was not chaos, but strategy. By honoring the gods of their subjects, the Hittite kings wove loyalty and tradition into the fabric of their rule. Religion was not a private matter. It was a state affair. The king and queen themselves served as high priests, conducting ceremonies that bound the people to the divine. Festivals punctuated the year, marking the cycles of planting and harvest, of war and peace. The gods were invoked to witness treaties, to curse oath-breakers, to bless the land with rain. Even their diplomacy carried a sacred weight. When the Hittites swore a treaty, they did not merely pledge words. They invoked their gods as guarantors. A king who broke a Hittite treaty did not just face earthly consequences. He faced divine wrath. In this way, politics and piety became inseparable, strengthening the bonds of empire. And what of their armies? Here, too, the Hittites excelled. They were among the first to perfect the use of the war chariot. Light, fast, and deadly, the chariot was the tank of the Bronze Age battlefield. Drawn by swift horses, manned by a driver and a warrior, it could shatter enemy lines with speed and force. The Hittites refined their design, making chariots larger and more stable, capable of carrying 3 men instead of 2. This gave them flexibility in battle. 1 to drive, 1 to shield, 1 to strike. Armed with bronze spears and bows, clad in armor of leather and bronze scales, the Hittite warriors were a formidable sight. When their armies marched, the earth trembled beneath them. And yet, they were more than mere fighters. Their campaigns were carefully planned, their strategies adapted to shifting circumstances. They were not reckless conquerors, but pragmatic soldiers of empire. By the time Suppiluliuma I ascended the throne, the Hittites had the tools they needed: a strong capital, a codified law of succession, a vast pantheon of gods, and a powerful army. All that remained was a king bold enough to wield them. Suppiluliuma was such a man. His reign in the 14th century before Common Era transformed the Hittites from a regional power into one of the great empires of the ancient world. He led campaigns deep into Syria, striking at the Mitanni and clashing with Egypt for dominance of the Levant. His victories expanded Hittite territory farther than ever before, securing their place among the club of great powers that defined the late Bronze Age. But his rise did not come without cost. War was endless, and with it came famine, plague, and unrest. Yet for a time, under Suppiluliuma, the Hittites reached a zenith, standing shoulder to shoulder with pharaohs and kings of Babylon. The world now recognized them as one of its great powers, and yet, even in triumph, shadows gathered. The seeds of future struggles were already being sown, seeds that would lead to one of the most famous confrontations in ancient history. The clash at Kadesh, where Hittite and Egyptian armies met in battle beneath the Syrian sun. But that is a story we will reach in time. For now, remember this: the Hittites, once fragile and forgotten, had carved their place into the heart of the Bronze Age. Their city of Hattusa stood tall. Their gods watched over them, and their kings dreamed of dominion. The forgotten empire was no longer in the shadows. It was rising toward its age of glory. By the time Suppiluliuma took the throne in the mid-14th century before Common Era, the Hittite kingdom had endured nearly 3 centuries of turmoil. It had survived assassinations, invasions, plagues, and betrayals. It had been battered and reduced, nearly eclipsed by its rivals. But in Suppiluliuma, the gods of Hatti had raised a king of extraordinary vision and strength. From the beginning, Suppiluliuma was no ordinary ruler. His rise was itself the product of rebellion and ambition. The throne had not been his by simple inheritance. He seized it through skill and force, ousting his brother Tudalia the Younger. It was a bold move, risky and dangerous, but it revealed his defining trait. Suppiluliuma would never accept half measures. He was born to expand, to dominate, to carve an empire worthy of memory. And so he set his eyes outward, to the south and east, toward Syria, where the rich lands of the Levant were contested by kingdoms great and small. To the east loomed the Mitanni, a Hurrian-speaking empire that had long rivaled the Hittites for influence. To the south stretched Egypt, now in its new kingdom strength, with pharaohs like Amenhotep and Akhenaten commanding armies and wealth. Between these giants lay the city-states of Syria, Carchemish, Aleppo, Kadesh, fertile, wealthy, but vulnerable. Suppiluliuma saw in them both opportunity and destiny. His campaigns into Syria were relentless. Marching his armies over mountains and deserts, he struck first at the Mitanni, shattering their influence in northern Mesopotamia. He was not content merely to raid. He dismantled their control city by city, absorbing their lands into the Hittite sphere. Where once the Mitanni had stood as equals to Hatti, they were reduced to vassals, shadows of their former power. In these campaigns, Suppiluliuma revealed both his cunning and his ruthlessness. He understood the value of diplomacy as much as war. Cities that submitted were granted treaties, swearing oaths of loyalty sealed by the gods. Their rulers became vassal kings, their autonomy preserved so long as their tribute and allegiance held. But those who resisted faced annihilation. Walls were torn down, leaders executed, populations deported. Suppiluliuma was not cruel for cruelty's sake, but he made it clear. Loyalty was rewarded, defiance punished. It was in this period that the Hittite diplomatic archive begins to swell with treaties, agreements between king and vassal, inscribed on clay tablets, laying out obligations in detail. These were not vague promises. They were structured contracts, specifying tribute, military support, and mutual defense. They were enforced not only by the king's armies, but by the gods themselves, called upon to curse any who broke the oath. In this way, Suppiluliuma built not just an empire of conquest, but an empire of law and order. As his power grew, so too did his prestige. No longer was Hatti seen as a peripheral kingdom of Anatolia. Suppiluliuma forced the world to recognize the Hittites as one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. Letters survive in the famous Amarna archives of Egypt, correspondence between Pharaoh Akhenaten and kings of Babylon, Assyria, and Hatti. In them, the kings address each other as brother, equals upon the world stage. For the first time, the king of Hatti was counted among them. Yet Egypt remained the great rival. The pharaohs had long considered Syria their sphere of influence, and the expansion of Hittite power threatened their grip. Cities like Kadesh, lying at the crossroads of trade and war, became flashpoints. Though Suppiluliuma struck deep into Syrian lands, Egypt pushed back, sending armies northward to defend their claims. It was in this crucible that the stage was set for one of the greatest confrontations in antiquity, the clash of Hatti and Egypt at the city of Kadesh. But before that battle was fought, a strange and tragic story unfolded, one that shows the reach of Hittite power and the risks that came with it. Suppiluliuma's campaigns had shaken the balance of power so thoroughly that even Egypt was destabilized. In the years around 1320 before Common Era, the pharaoh Tutankhamun, the boy king who restored Egypt after the heresy of Akhenaten, died suddenly, still in his youth. His widow, left without an heir, faced a kingdom in turmoil. And in her desperation, she turned not to an Egyptian noble, but to Suppiluliuma, king of the Hittites. A letter survives from this queen, known to history as Dakamunzu. She wrote to Suppiluliuma, pleading, "My husband has died. I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you send me one of your sons, he shall become my husband. I will not choose a servant of mine to make him my husband. I am afraid." It was an astonishing request. Never before had an Egyptian queen asked a foreign king to provide a pharaoh. Egypt's throne, sacred and divine, was being offered to a Hittite prince. To Suppiluliuma, the opportunity was dazzling. If his son married the queen, the Hittites could rule Egypt itself. At first, Suppiluliuma hesitated, suspecting trickery. But when a second letter came, insisting her plea was genuine, he agreed. He sent his son Zananza to Egypt. The prince never arrived. Somewhere on the journey, perhaps intercepted by Egyptian factions, perhaps murdered by political rivals, Zananza was killed. When word reached Suppiluliuma, his fury was unbounded. He accused the Egyptians of treachery and betrayal. His army struck at Egyptian territories in Syria, with renewed ferocity. The dream of a Hittite prince on the throne of Egypt had died, but the rivalry between the two powers had become a burning enmity. And in the shadow of this tragedy came a curse that would haunt the empire. Among the captives taken in Suppiluliuma's wars was a plague. The records speak of sickness spreading through Hatti, devastating its people, killing nobles and commoners alike. Even Suppiluliuma himself succumbed. The great conqueror, who had raised Hatti to its golden age, was struck down by disease. His body joined the ancestors, and his empire passed to his sons. But his legacy endured. Under Suppiluliuma, the Hittites had risen from obscurity to stand as equals with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. They commanded armies that could march across continents, wielded treaties that bound kings and gods alike, and carved their name into the memory of the ancient world. And yet, the rivalry with Egypt remained unresolved. It would fall to his son, Mersili II, and then to his grandson, Muwatalli II, to carry that struggle forward. It is with Muwatalli that the clash reached its climax at Kadesh in the year 1274 before Common Era. There, beneath the blazing sun of Syria, the greatest chariot battle the world had ever seen was fought. Hittite and Egyptian armies collided in thunder and dust in a struggle not only for land, but for dominance of the ancient Near East. That battle and the peace that followed would define the legacy of the Hittites for centuries to come. The year is 1274 before Common Era. The Hittite Empire, forged by Suppiluliuma and tested by his heirs, has grown into a formidable power. To the south, Egypt, under the young pharaoh Ramses II, later remembered as Ramses the Great, is equally determined to extend its dominion. Between them lies the prize, the city of Kadesh. Kadesh was no ordinary city. Resting on the banks of the Orontes River in what is now Syria, it was a jewel of the Levant. Its fertile plains fed armies. Its position commanded trade routes between Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. To control Kadesh was to hold a gateway of empire. For decades, the city had shifted hands, vassal to Hittite 1 year, Egyptian the next. Each power coveted it, and neither would yield. Now, at last, their ambitions collided in open war. Muwatalli II, grandson of Suppiluliuma, ruled from Hattusa. He had inherited not only his grandfather's empire, but also his rivalry with Egypt. Ramesses, still in the prime of his youth, led Egypt's armies northward, dreaming of glory, determined to reclaim Kadesh for the pharaohs. Both kings prepared for a confrontation unlike any the world had seen. The age of the chariot had reached its zenith. These were not small skirmishes, not raids or border wars. This was a gathering of thousands upon thousands, marching across deserts and mountains, converging on a single city. Ramesses marched with 4 divisions, named for Egypt's gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. Each division numbered thousands, accompanied by chariots, supplies, and camp followers. His army, stretched across the landscape like a moving city. Ramesses himself led from the front, his chariot adorned with golden emblems, his name proclaimed as divine. But Mu'atali was no less prepared. From across Anatolia, from vassal states and allied lands, he summoned his forces. The records claim he gathered 30,000 infantry and 3,500 chariots, more than Egypt had ever faced. He stationed them north of Kadesh, hidden beyond the Orontes, waiting for the moment to strike. The clash began not with swords, but with deception. As Ramesses advanced, 2 Hittite spies, disguised as deserters, approached his camp. They claimed that Mu'atali and his army were still far to the north, unready to fight. Ramesses believed them. Confident in his advantage, he pressed forward recklessly. His divisions stretched thin along the road. It was a trap. As the Egyptian division of Amun encamped near Kadesh, Hittite chariots burst from concealment. They thundered across the plain, wheels churning dust, horses screaming, warriors shouting. They smashed into the Egyptian camp, scattering men, overturning tents, sending panic through the ranks. Ramesses himself was caught in the chaos. The inscriptions that survive, inscribed by Ramesses on temple walls, describe how he stood alone, abandoned, calling upon Amun for strength, and driving back the enemy with his own chariot. Whether this was truth or royal propaganda, it reveals the intensity of the moment. The pharaoh himself at the heart of the storm, his survival uncertain. Yet the Egyptians did not break. Reinforcements arrived, divisions regrouped, and Ramesses rallied his forces. Wave after wave of Hittite chariots crashed against the Egyptian line. For hours the battle raged, dust and blood mixing beneath the Syrian sun. The ground shook with the pounding of hooves, the clash of bronze weapons, the cries of the wounded. But neither side could claim victory. By nightfall, the field was littered with bodies and broken chariots. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands, but Egypt had not been destroyed. Both sides declared themselves victorious, inscribing their triumphs upon stone. But the truth was clear. The battle was a stalemate. Yet in its aftermath, something extraordinary occurred. For centuries, war had defined the relationship between Egypt and Hatti. But now, exhausted and bloodied, both powers recognized the futility of endless conflict. Years later, under Hattusa III, the Hittites and Egyptians would sign a peace treaty, the earliest surviving international treaty in history. Its words, preserved on clay tablets and temple walls, still echo today. 2 great kings, once enemies, now bound in peace, swearing friendship before their gods. This treaty was not mere words. It cemented a new balance of power. Egypt and Hatti, weary of struggle, turned from war to alliance. They exchanged gifts, letters, even royal brides. A daughter of the Hittite king would one day marry Ramesses himself, joining the 2 houses in blood as well as treaty. So, from the dust and thunder of Kadesh arose not only destruction, but diplomacy. The Hittites, once feared conquerors, now stood as equals, partners in the great web of Bronze Age powers. For Mu'tali, the battle was both triumph and burden. He had held Kadesh, but at great cost. For Ramesses, it was both disaster and propaganda, his monuments declaring him the hero of the day, even as his true victory was survival. For the world, it was a reminder of the fragile balance upon which empires rested. And for us, looking back across 3 millennia, it is a moment frozen in time. The thunder of hooves, the flash of bronze, the roar of kings echoing across history. But the story of the Hittites does not end at Kadesh. Their empire, though powerful, stood on the edge of new challenges. Internal strife, foreign rivals, famine, and the shadow of collapse loomed ever closer. The peace with Egypt bought them time, but it could not prevent the storms that were gathering. For even the mightiest empires of the Bronze Age would one day fall, and the Hittites, forgotten for centuries, would vanish into silence. The story of the Hittites is not only one of kings and battles. Behind the walls of Hattusa, beyond the clash of chariots, there lived a people, farmers and scribes, priests and merchants, artisans and soldiers, whose lives sustained the empire. To understand the Hittites fully, we must pause and step into their world. Let us begin in the city of Hattusa. Imagine walking through its massive stone gates. The Lion Gate towers above you, its carved guardians glaring with eternal vigilance. Passing inside, you find yourself in a bustling capital. Narrow streets wind through houses of mud brick and stone. Children run between doorways. Merchants haggle over goods. Oxen pull carts piled high with grain. The air is alive with the smoke of hearth fires, the sound of hammer on bronze, the scent of bread baking in clay ovens. In the heart of the city stands the great temple, dedicated to the storm god Tarhunt and the sun goddess of Arena. Its courtyards are wide, its walls lined with storerooms filled with offerings, grain, wine, honey, and oil, gifts to the divine. Priests chant prayers in the flickering light of torches. The king himself, high priest of the realm, leads sacred rituals, binding his people to the gods. Religion infused every aspect of Hittite life. To them, the world was governed not by a single god, but by a vast assembly. Every city, every mountain, every river had its deity. This inclusiveness earned them the title, the people of 1,000 gods. Far from weakening their faith, it strengthened it. Conquered peoples did not see their gods erased, but honored, woven into the Hittite pantheon. In this way, conquest became continuity, and faith became empire. Festivals marked the rhythm of the year. In spring, when fields were sown, rituals were performed to ensure the rains would come. In autumn, at harvest, the people gave thanks to the gods for fertility and abundance. One of the most important was the Peruli festival, a celebration of renewal, where myth and ritual intertwined. Priests reenacted the victory of the storm god over chaos, affirming the cosmic order upon which the kingdom depended. But the Hittites were not only devout, they were also pragmatic. Their archives reveal a society deeply concerned with law and justice. The Hittite law codes, preserved on clay tablets, reveal much about their values. Unlike the famous Code of Hammurabi, which often prescribed death for crimes, Hittite laws leaned toward fines and restitution. If a man injured another, he paid compensation. If property was stolen, it was returned with interest. Only the gravest crimes, treason, witchcraft, rebellion, brought execution. This reveals a society not of cruelty, but of balance. Justice was not about vengeance, but about restoring harmony. The goal was order, not terror. Family life, too, is preserved in these laws and records. Marriage was a contract, binding families together. Women held a notable degree of respect and authority. Queens, known as Tawananas, were powerful figures, often ruling alongside their husbands, sometimes even outliving them and continuing to wield influence. In Hittite treaties and letters, queens' names appear beside those of kings, testifying to their prominence. Daily life for ordinary Hittites revolved around the cycles of the land. Farmers plowed fields with oxen, sowing barley and wheat. Shepherds tended flocks of sheep and goats in the hills. Hunters pursued deer and wild boar in the forests. In workshops, craftsmen shaped bronze into tools and weapons, spun wool into textiles, carved wood and stone into objects both useful and sacred. Trade brought luxuries: cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia's mines, tin from distant lands, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan. Even in their writing, we glimpse their humanity. Letters between kings and vassals reveal anxiety, pride, and frustration. Petitions from citizens beg for justice. Prayers inscribed on tablets speak of personal devotion, fear of plague, hope for deliverance. In these words, the Hittites step out of myth and stand before us as people, flawed, striving, faithful. Their architecture, too, speaks volumes. The walls of Hattusa, with their immense gates, were not only defenses, but symbols of permanence. Nearby, at Yazilakaya, a sanctuary carved into the rock, processions of gods are etched into the stone. Lines of deities, each named, each honored, a pantheon immortalized in rock. These carvings were more than art. They were cosmic declarations, affirmations that the order of heaven was reflected on earth. Yet beneath this splendor lay fragility. The Hittite heartland, though rich in forests and minerals, was vulnerable to drought. Crops could fail, and famine could stalk the land. Their empire, vast and diverse, was held together by treaties and vassal kings, loyal so long as power was strong, rebellious when it weakened. Their gods were many, but their favor uncertain. When plague struck, the people wondered which deity had been offended and sought answers in ritual and sacrifice. Even their greatest strength, the chariot, was bound to the delicate system of the Bronze Age. Without bronze, without tin, their armies could not fight. Trade routes stretched thin across mountains and deserts, easily broken by war or disaster. The very fabric of their world was woven of threads that could unravel with startling speed. And so, the Hittite Empire was both splendid and fragile. Splendid in its walls, its temples, its laws, its treaties. Fragile in its reliance on crops, on loyalty, on trade, on the favor of gods unseen. This fragility would one day prove fatal, but not yet. For now, in the late 13th century BCE, the Hittites still stood proud. Their peace with Egypt had secured their southern flank. Their culture thrived. Their gods were honored. Their capital remained strong. And yet, on the horizon, storms gathered. Rivals in the east and west watched for weakness. Famine and plague gnawed at the edges of stability. And far away, movements of peoples, migrations, invasions, the stirring of what would one day be called the Sea Peoples, were beginning to shake the balance of the entire Bronze Age world. The Hittites had reached their height, but the higher an empire climbs, the farther it has to fall. History is often told as a tale of rising powers, of kings and conquests, of greatness achieved. But just as important, and just as haunting, are the stories of collapse. For the Hittite Empire, the end came not in a single blow, but in a storm of disasters, each compounding the other, until the very foundations of their world crumbled. It began with famine. The Hittite heartland, high in the Anatolian plateau, was vulnerable to drought. Without steady rains, crops withered. Grain stores dwindled. In desperate clay tablets, we read the voices of kings pleading with allies. Send grain, that my people may live and not die. From Egypt, from Ugarit, from Cyprus, shipments were begged, bargained, or demanded. When the Nile failed, when the seas grew dangerous, starvation spread. Alongside famine came plague. For decades, waves of sickness haunted the empire. Some texts describe sacrifices and prayers meant to appease angry gods, for it was believed the pestilence was divine punishment. Whole cities were weakened, armies thinned, royal courts shaken by death. The king himself often led rituals of purification, desperate to cleanse the land. As the Hittites struggled, their neighbors grew bold. To the north, the Kaska tribes, long a thorn in the empire's side, raided deeper into Anatolia. To the west, the rising Mycenaeans pressed across the Aegean. To the east, Assyria, once checked by Hittite might, surged with new ambition. The Hittite grip on its vassals weakened. States, once bound by oath, began to waver, their loyalty dissolving as imperial strength faltered. And then came the storms from the sea. The late Bronze Age was a world tied together by trade. Copper, tin, grain, wine, timber, horses, slaves. Ships crisscrossed the eastern Mediterranean, carrying goods and cultures between empires. But around the 12th century before Common Era, those same waters carried something else. Waves of migrants, raiders, warriors. What later records would call the Sea Peoples. Who they were remains uncertain. Some were likely displaced tribes from the Aegean, others from Anatolia or the Levant, driven by famine, drought, or war. They came with families, carts, and ships, both settlers and conquerors. For the great kingdoms, they were a terror. Coastal cities burned, ports were abandoned, routes severed. The Hittites, landlocked but dependent on trade through vassal ports like Ugarit, felt the blow keenly. Letters from Ugarit speak of desperate pleas for aid as enemy ships appeared offshore. "The enemy ships are here," one tablet cries. "What can we do?" But the aid never came. Ugarit was destroyed, its ruins buried beneath ash, its cries silenced. Within Anatolia itself, chaos spread. The empire's core was pressed from every side. Grain could not reach the plateau. Armies starved before they could march. Rival kings eyed the throne. Civil strife gnawed at unity. The very bonds of loyalty that had held the Hittite world together now snapped, one by one. By the early 12th century, before Common Era, Hattusa, the great capital, the city of lion gates and towering walls, was abandoned. Its palaces burned, its archives buried in ash. Whether by invading enemies, rebellious subjects, or starving mobs, we cannot say. But the silence that followed was complete. The capital of the Hittites, the seat of kings for centuries, lay in ruins. And with Hattusa's fall, the empire itself vanished. The once mighty Hittites who had battled Egypt at Kadesh, who had ruled lands from Anatolia to Syria, who had signed the world's first peace treaty, were gone. Their gods were forgotten, their names erased from memory. For 3,000 years, the world did not know their story. Their cities lay hidden beneath earth and forest. Their language, Hittite, the first recorded Indo-European tongue, was buried in clay, unread. When later peoples looked upon their ruins, they did not remember the Hittites. In the Bible, they appear only as shadowy figures, one among many tribes of Canaan. To the Greeks, they were unknown. To the Romans, invisible. They had vanished so completely that some scholars in later centuries doubted they had ever existed at all. And yet, their memory endured, silently, in the stones of Hattusa, in the inscriptions of kings, in the broken tablets that waited patiently beneath the soil. Their fall was real, but so too was their legacy, waiting to be rediscovered. The collapse of the Hittite Empire was part of a larger cataclysm. Across the eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms crumbled. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece fell. Ugarit burned. Egypt itself fought for survival against the Sea Peoples. The interconnected world of the Bronze Age shattered, ushering in centuries of darkness and isolation. The Hittites were not alone in their fall, but theirs was among the most complete. An empire erased, a people scattered, a memory lost. And so the story of the Hittites passes into silence. But history is never silent forever. For 3,000 years, the Hittites lay forgotten. Their empire gone, their cities in ruin, their language unread. They were erased from memory so completely that when the Bible mentioned a people called the Hittites, many believed it was a mere echo, perhaps even a mistake. No great empire was remembered, only a name, vague and unanchored. But the earth does not forget. Stones endure. Clay preserves. The Hittites would rise again, not as kings, but as fragments waiting to be pieced together. The locals called the site Boğazköy. To the outside world, It was a mystery. Excavations began cautiously. As the first stones were cleared, as broken tablets were lifted from the soil, scholars realized they had uncovered the remains of a great city. Hattusa, though its name was not yet known. The ruins were vast. Temples, palaces, fortifications sprawling across the Anatolian plateau. But most puzzling of all were the tablets. Thousands of them, inscribed in strange cuneiform signs, written in a language no one could read. The puzzle deepened. Some suspected the site was Hurrian, others Assyrian, others yet an unknown culture entirely. The evidence did not fit the great empires already known: Egypt, Babylon, Assyria. This was something else, something forgotten. The key came in the early 20th century. Scholars comparing the language of the Bagaske tablets with others began to notice familiar patterns. The words seemed to echo not only Semitic or Mesopotamian tongues, but something closer to the languages of Europe. Slowly, painstakingly, the signs gave way to meaning. The breakthrough was made by the Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný in 1915. Looking at a phrase inscribed in cuneiform, he realized its words resembled Indo-European roots. One sentence stood out: Ninda on ezatani, watar ma ekutani. He read it as, "You will eat bread, and you will drink water." The code was cracked. The lost language of the Hittites, the earliest attested Indo-European tongue, had been brought back to life. With it, the identity of the ruins became clear. This was no minor tribe, no forgotten village. This was the capital of a forgotten empire. One that had once rivaled Egypt, fought at Kadesh, ruled Anatolia and Syria. The Hittites were real. Their history had been written in clay and stone, waiting for us to listen. From the earth of Hattusa, thousands of tablets emerged. Treaties, laws, myths, letters, rituals. We hear kings addressing vassals, scribes recording prayers, merchants tallying goods, priests invoking gods. We read the treaty with Ramesses, the oldest known peace treaty, its words echoing across the millennia. As for these terms, the 1,000 gods of the Hittites, together with the 1,000 gods of Egypt, are witnesses. We find myths of storm gods battling serpents, of sacred festivals renewing the world. We read laws that speak of justice, not through terror, but through balance and restitution. We encounter the names of queens who wielded power, of kings who struggled with plague, of soldiers, envoys, and ordinary men and women whose voices had long been silent. The stones, too, speak. At Yazilikaya, the rock sanctuary near Hattusa, archaeologists traced the lines of gods carved into the cliff face. Row upon row, divine processions still march across the stone, frozen in eternal ceremony. These reliefs, weathered by time, yet clear, remind us that to the Hittites, religion was not abstract, but embodied in every hill, every stream, every moment of life. And so the forgotten empire returned, from disbelief to recognition, from silence to story. The Hittites emerged from shadow into history once more. Today, the ruins of Hattusa stand as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors walk the same gates, stand before the same lion guardians, look out over the Anatolian hills as the kings of old once did. In museums, the tablets of their archives are preserved, each one a voice from 3 millennia past. Scholars still debate their mysteries, the details of their fall, the origins of their gods, the scope of their influence. But one truth is clear. They were not shadows, not inventions, not forgotten tribes. They were a great empire, as real and as complex. And so we arrive at the final chapter of our long night with the Hittites. From their rise in the rugged hills of Anatolia, to their battles with Egypt at Kadesh, from the splendor of Hattusa to the silence of their fall. The story of the Hittites is at once magnificent and haunting. They were forgotten for millennia, yet their imprint endures in law, in language, in the very foundations of history. What then is their legacy? First, the Hittites remind us of the fragility of empire. They were mighty, yes. They commanded armies, ruled vast territories, signed treaties with pharaohs. But their power rested on delicate threads, trade routes that could be severed, harvests that could fail, alliances that could waver. In their collapse, we see how interconnected the Bronze Age world was, and how easily one break in the chain could unravel. Second, the Hittites reveal the richness of cultural exchange. They did not destroy the gods of conquered peoples. They adopted them, weaving them into their pantheon. They did not impose a single rigid system. They built bridges between traditions, creating a religious mosaic that reflected the diversity of their world. In their laws, their treaties, their diplomacy, we see a people both practical and visionary, capable of crafting agreements that resonate even today. Consider the treaty with Egypt, the world's oldest surviving peace treaty. Its words, inscribed in clay and carved in stone, speak of eternal brotherhood between two once bitter rivals. It is a message that transcends time, that even the greatest enemies can lay down arms, can choose cooperation over destruction. In an age when war. Third, the Hittites stand as guardians of language. Their rediscovered tongue, Hittite, proved to be the earliest written Indo-European language. For linguists, it was a key that opened doors, a missing piece of the puzzle of how languages spread and evolved. When Hosni deciphered their words, "You will eat bread and you will drink water," he did more than translate. He bridged millennia, allowing voices thought lost forever to speak again. Their myths, too, live on. The storm god battling the serpent recalls echoes in later traditions. The struggles of Zeus and Typhon, or Thor and Jormungandr. Through such echoes, we glimpse how stories travel, how symbols endure, how cultures influence one another across ages. Even their ruins teach us. Walk the walls of Hattusa, stand before the Lion Gate, trace the reliefs at Yazilikaya, and you feel the weight of time, the endurance of stone. Though the city was burned and abandoned, though centuries of silence followed, the stones still whisper. They remind us that civilizations may fall, but traces remain, waiting to be rediscovered. Perhaps their greatest legacy, however, is the very fact of their rediscovery. For centuries, they were unknown, their empire erased from human memory. And yet, through patient digging, careful study, and the persistence of curiosity, they return to us. Their story teaches us that history is never final, never complete. Beneath the soil, behind the myths, within the forgotten lines of ancient texts, whole civilizations await their turn to speak. The Hittites are not alone in this. Around the world, countless lost peoples lie waiting. Each discovery expands our understanding of what it means to be human, of how many paths our ancestors walked, of how many voices contributed to the great chorus of civilization. And so, as we close the story of the Hittites, we do not only remember them as conquerors, or as victims of collapse, or as names on clay tablets. We remember them as a people, complex, flawed, brilliant, fragile, enduring. They remind us that even when forgotten, history can return, and that no empire, no matter how lost, is ever truly gone, so long as someone listens. So tonight, as the story draws to its end, picture the high walls of Hattusa once more. Picture the chariots rolling out to war, the priests chanting in torchlight, the scribes pressing words into clay, the laughter of children in the narrow streets. Picture the storm god Tarhunt, his chariot drawn by bulls, flashing lightning across the sky. The Hittites are gone, but their echoes remain. And now, as you drift into sleep, let their story rest within you. Another thread in the endless tapestry of human history. A tapestry woven of triumph and tragedy, of memory and forgetting, of civilizations lost and civilizations found again. The forgotten empire of the Hittites has spoken, and we, across 3,000 years, have listened. And so ends the story of the Hittites, a people who rose to greatness, then fell into silence, only to return to us through stone and clay. Now, you can let your eyes close and your body rest. Remember, history never truly disappears. It waits patiently for those who will listen. If you enjoyed this journey through time, please support the channel with a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next forgotten civilization we uncover together. Rest well, for tomorrow brings new stories, but tonight, let the Hittites guide you into your dreams.